he could end up with a championship and finals MVP on 3 different teams.
Lebron trying to bully his way in with one hand.
This historic 2020 NBA championship belongs to the Los Angeles Lakers.
Laker Nation want their respect, and I want my damn respect too.
Now that happened quickly, or at least it feels that way. From joining a franchise with no other star player that had been underwater for the last 5 seasons, to successfully winning a championship with 3 different franchises, this one just so happening to be the most storied in NBA history. See, the thing is, and always has been, that LeBron's case for GOAT isn't like the other guys. He's still playing obviously for one, but he's also adding to it in the 17th year of his career when most other players would be hurting their cases around that time if they'd even made it that far. So now the job becomes to dissect exactly what he's added and how he's added it since we left off over 2 years ago in a story that is miraculously still being written. Also, the aim is to specifically highlight the process of how we got here, because it's easy to forget now that none of this looked likely when he took on this challenge in the summer of 2018, and reviewing the series of events that led to his 4th title is nearly as important to his legacy as him winning it. 2 years ago, LeBron's case for GOAT seemed about full, with only a bit more packing left needed to convince skeptical parties. The thing that's now easy to forget is there was no guarantee that empty space was ever going to be filled. He was fresh off of his 6th NBA Finals loss and his 2nd straight to the juggernaut Warriors, who seemed to have all but abolished parity in the league. That didn't matter to some people though, as it was quite popular to overlook the daunting task of even beating that team once, and instead focus on the fact that LeBron had now lost the same amount of finals Jordan won while going undefeated. Not only was Golden State brandishing the most talented roster ever put to paper, but A, LeBron's roster was quite literally the exact opposite, and B, no one had any real clue how much longer it would go on. Given the ages of the Warriors' core players, in theory they could have gone on to compete for around the next 5 titles if they so pleased, also if health would allow. Meanwhile, LeBron was facing yet another free agency decision, and the question had become less about whether he would really ditch Cleveland for a 2nd time, and more so concerning where he could go that would even give him a chance to contend in this climate. The Cavs had totally fallen apart at the worst time possible, losing Kyrie and going through massive roster turnover in the exact moment LeBron had been planning out the rest of his career. For Cleveland, that was something similar to having the coronavirus run wild while trying to be re-elected. With the front office once again showing signs of incompetence, LeBron knew better than to leave the final years of his career at their mercy. So if he was truly chasing Jordan, and realized he couldn't do so losing every year, something like these Sixers appeared to make sense. A young core featuring Ben Simmons and Embiid, or maybe there was some way Houston could make it work, playing by the side of one of his best friends and smartest players in the NBA, Chris Paul, all while being flanked by the most dangerous offensive player in James Harden. Houston had been just one win away and possibly only an injury away from knocking off the Warriors as it stood. How would anybody deal with LeBron having weapons like that? Well, nobody would ever know, because out of the entire option package he had that summer, he chose the Los Angeles Lakers. Now, although they'd failed to attract any big names in recent times and were stumbling their way through a rebuild, it was still LA, and being able to sell LeBron James on top of that would make getting a 2nd star relatively simple in theory. On the other hand, the biggest name they were going to possibly pair with him that summer was Paul George, and given the existence of the Warriors, that duo wasn't going to make a whole lot of noise in the grand scheme of things. PG wound up not even going there anyways, so now LeBron was stuck with what honestly looked like the Cavaliers of the West. Just a few halfway decent support pieces that he'd be fortunate to push to a 4th seed given the conference's competition. There was a rather logical question surrounding all of this. Why? At age 34, with the Warriors holding the league hostage and Father Time ready to strike at any given moment, what was the purpose of joining a rebuilding project? And a rebuilding project in the same conference as Golden State at that? The obvious answer was the Lakers' master plan to target disgruntled Pelican star Anthony Davis, who was approaching the final year of his contract and gaining more leverage over his future with each passing day. But even then, depleting this Lakers roster through trade mid-season just to have LeBron and AD play with G League players would barely put a scratch on Golden State. Even if they were able to retool it during the 2019 offseason, it still stood relatively little chance against the juggernaut. But that was the quickest way to make the duo a reality, and the alternative, should that initial trade fail for some reason, was to wait until New Orleans was forced to trade him late into the 2020 season. Of course there would be many competitors for his services, or wait until the 2020 free agency altogether. Either way, there were no guarantees, and from the perspective of 2019, this still did not appear like a great thing for LeBron's career. It was basically a waiting game for AD or some 2nd star, all while he got got older, not even knowing what would become of the Warriors or how long he had left at a high level. And so with those crucial questions hanging in the balance, the 2019 season began, and LeBron kicked off the next and presumably final chapter of his career with no real assurance this move would ever add to his legacy, convincing many that this move had mostly been motivated by business. In reality though, with his case already having been so solid before the move, it was also clearly a low-risk, high-reward option. Would going to LA and never bringing them a title truly hurt his legacy? Given the state of the league at the time, as long as he kept his play up and landed the Lakers somewhere decent, he wasn't really sticking his neck out too far. On the flip side, if things ever somehow did work out, he'd have won with 3 different franchises, elevating himself onto the pantheon of Laker greats, all while doing the one thing critics always said he couldn't do: dominate the Western Conference.
James off the steal. James with the stuff. It's James to the bucket again.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Bron.
With LeBron's career being the movie that it so often seemed to be, his inaugural Laker points came in looking eerily similar to how he began his career. Although this magical beginning would unfortunately not set the tone for the season, or even that game. To start, it was more just fun than anything, seeing the best player in the league and a GOAT candidate migrate to this historic franchise, playing in front of a host of celebrities and in that iconic dim lighting of staples. Most nights it was just fascinating to see them in exciting games, and to dissect how LeBron would dominate without being flanked by much elite shooting as he so often had been. Still, as many suspected before the season, this seemed to be amounting to exactly nothing, with Los Angeles losing their first 3 games of the season and key players being suspended early on as a result of the famous brawl with Houston. As it had always went in the West, each game was crucial as one loss could be the difference between a 5th seed or no playoffs at all. But miraculously, LeBron had still led this Lakers team to a 19-14 record by their Christmas Day meeting with the Warriors, who were merely 4 wins ahead of them in the standings. Even more surprising was the Lakers practically controlling the entire game, which meant very little in the way of a potential playoff matchup obviously, but was still something to behold given the difference in rosters. It was also yet another time LeBron kept things competitive with Golden State despite having the inferior team. However, things just seemed to be going a bit too well given the circumstances, and perhaps they were.
James lost it, gets it back. Kuzma for 3.
Disciplined defense.
And James holding his left leg. And obviously his groin area as well. He's shaken up on that play.
Roughly 4 minutes into the third quarter, LeBron would take a slip that hadn't appeared too serious until the display of obvious pain riddled across his face. This was plaguing a guy we'd never seen suffer anything close to dangerous in terms of injuries, so if he really felt something to the tune that he needed to limp away from the game while being unable to return, it was probably serious, and serious it was. Smack dab in the middle of what was becoming yet another signature LeBron season, this time in the Western Conference with no other superstar by his side. He'd go on to miss a career-high 17 consecutive games with a strained groin, probably only returning when he did because his team so desperately needed him. Through these 17 matches that he missed over that month-long span, the Lakers had lost 11 of them, and with the calendar turning to February, they were now fighting an uphill battle to get into the West tough playoff bracket. LA was also fighting the clock to acquire Anthony Davis. Amongst other things Magic Johnson had pitched to LeBron on joining LA, chief amongst them had to have been the assurance he wouldn't be playing out the final years of his career on a rebuilding project, because how would that have made any sense? As a matter of fact, LeBron on a team full of 20-year-olds with no realistic path to the finals for the next 2 or 3 seasons honestly did not make sense for either party. It stunted LA's rebuilding process, and James would get no closer to adding to his legacy. This is part of why for the first time in his career, there began to be rumblings that it may have been the best move to trade LeBron James.
It could be a trade with, for an Anthony Davis, or I think they need to explore trading LeBron for getting as much as they can.
What are you doing? Seriously. No, seriously, what are you doing?
No, you got to get on the right timeline. If I could trade him for the Clippers into cap space, which would give me a better chance to get Durant or Kawhi Leonard, would I not do that?
Now that we've gotten to witness how things turn out, it seems like no more than a troll take that this was ever a discussion. However, things had gotten really bad for the Lakers in a short time period. The Pelicans had chosen to not negotiate in good faith with the Lakers in relation to the AD trade. The Lakers brass had offered everything aside from their soul to make that deal go through, and still, the Pelicans would also ask for exactly that. So at that point, the message was clear. Anthony Davis was not going to be a Laker. Not anytime soon at least. If New Orleans wasn't going to take everything everything LA realistically had to offer in February, why were they going to do it 4 or 5 months later? And with that, LeBron and the Lakers were stranded. He'd infamously declared playoff mode upon returning from his injury, but it hadn't been hard to see that he'd actually just returned with the injury. He was still good, but clearly a step slower and, for the first time, human. Between the mileage of 8 straight finals and this new injury, the worst of his career, it had appeared Father Time was finally getting through. And if that was true, the Warriors were still together, and the Lakers were not getting Anthony Davis, then what purpose did LeBron serve there? The situation had the potential to become similar to when the Lakers obviously needed to rebuild, yet were accommodating a much lesser version of Kobe for the final 3 years with the fringe hope that some star like Carmelo Anthony would come play with him. There was no doubt that had been one reason the Lakers were so bad throughout the decade, and the seeds of repeating that fate were being planted here. Perhaps it was this potential massive failure that helped lead to Magic Johnson abruptly resigning as Lakers president in early April, and it was definitely one of the more shocking developments of that season. The man who had sold LeBron on the future in the City of Angels walked away from it all without even telling him. Although Magic cited many personal reasons for the decision, it was hard not to see the correlation between this failed experiment and his untimely departure. The 2019 season would flame out quietly for the Lakers as they would essentially shut down LeBron in hopes of keeping him healthy, and rest at a disappointing 37-45 finish, merely 2 wins above what they'd done just 1 season before. This would also go down as the first time LeBron had missed the playoffs since 2005, and it made him a rather easy target for slander regarding the fact that it was his first year in the West. With that, his case truly did appear closed. What was there, and it was still incredible, but there was no clear path to adding any more to it. And after applying recency bias, a flameout like the one seemingly approaching might have even wound up hurting it. There, however, was a single glimmer of hope. On April 17th, the Pelicans would name David Griffin their vice president of basketball operations. Griffin also just so happened to have been the general manager for the Cavaliers in LeBron's time there. This coming nearly 2 months after the firing of GM Dell Demps, who had played a practical joke on the Lakers rather than actually trying to move Anthony Davis. Speaking of AD, to wind down the Pelican season, he was either playing sparingly or not at all, as it had been made clear there was no path forward with him in New Orleans, so it could really only hurt the Pelicans should something happen to him taking his trade value. And if there was any confusion on where he stood on his future, Davis wore a "That's all folks" t-shirt to his final game with the Pelicans. That had to be one of the more striking declarations of independence between a star and the host team. Still, nobody could be 100% sure where Davis would end up. The Celtics had seemingly successfully gotten the Pelicans to wait until the offseason to negotiate. However, AD's father had made it pretty clear should he have wound up there, he'd be no more than a rental. Dealing with a practical rental already in Kyrie Irving, talks there pretty much never seemed serious. With Griffin at the helms in New Orleans, their position on negotiating with the Lakers seemed like it softened up a bit. And then, the final domino.
The 4th pick in the 2019 NBA Draft goes to the Los Angeles Lakers.
LA would totally luck out, walking away from the lottery with the 4th overall pick of a relatively exciting draft. And just like that, the future of Anthony Davis and the Lakers had never seemed clearer. Between the changes in leadership in New Orleans and another bargaining chip for LA, they could have basically started printing up Anthony Davis Laker jerseys right then and there. Neither LA or LeBron really ever hid their intentions. And as if the stars had aligned, the juggernaut vanished.
Ibaka trying to stay with Durant, knocks it away, and Durant's limping. Durant goes down holding his leg, and Durant grabbing that right leg. Thompson running the floor, and a foul. And Thompson grabs his left knee, now writhing in pain.
One after one, the chips were just falling in place to create a path for LeBron to add more to his case. Not only had the unfortunate events of the 2019 season directly led to some much needed rest, the Warriors were now toast for at least 1 season. With an Achilles injury to Kevin Durant in his contract year and an ACL to Klay Thompson in the Warriors' final game, there was already going to be parity for the 2020 season regardless of if they retained that core. And if they did, which no longer seemed likely after multiple strenuous events on player relationships, who knew if they'd ever be the same? The Warriors' death grip on the league was no more. They were reigning champs no more, and the throne was once again for the taking.
Adrian Wojnarowski reporting that Kevin Durant is in fact headed to Brooklyn to join Kyrie Irving and DeAndre Jordan.
Rocket blast. OKC sending point guard Westbrook to Houston.
He's teaming up with James Harden yet again.
Breaking news into Sports Center. Kawhi Leonard has informed teams that he will be signing with the Los Angeles Clippers.
I don't believe Kawhi Leonard was going to go to the Clippers without a second start.
Sit down for this. Paul George to the Clippers to join Kawhi.
Suddenly, the league was teeming with competition again, and the Lakers were sitting dangerously close to the top when the dust settled. Upon acquiring AD, there were even a few days where it seemed highly possible they'd land Kawhi Leonard, despite his just having won the title. But in relation to LeBron's case, it's a good thing they didn't. A big three featuring 3 top 5 to 7 players wouldn't have been a whole lot more respected than the Warriors. However, it's hard not to imagine some fans would have relished in their revenge. But in reality, revenge for LeBron would have to take place on an even playing field, where the Lakers were not the clear-cut favorites. LeBron, with another top 5 player, possibly the greatest teammate of his career, was being painted somewhat as the underdog of his own city. The Clippers of all teams had emerged as a squad captivating imaginations, and not without reason. It was featuring reigning Finals MVP Kawhi Leonard, who just got done with one of the greatest playoff runs we'd ever seen, on the perimeter with another lockdown star in Paul George. And he'd come off of a season where people briefly campaigned for him to be MVP. For each other, they were the best teammates they had ever had while being the star of a team. And if that was not enough, this Clippers team had shocked quite a few people in the playoffs and in the regular season in general. So this defensively minded duo, combined with their supporting pieces, were being pushed as LeBron's next test in his case for GOAT. And the story really was writing itself. Kawhi and PG, 2 superstars with past stories of their own involving LeBron, all while sharing the same building as him. Rumblings for Kawhi being the best player in the league, one team trying to become the winningest franchise in the history of the league, and one that perfectly juxtaposed them by being the joke of the city for decades, and probably the league. For LeBron to get this next title, there was thought to be no way around that confrontation, and losing it, while consequently losing the opportunity to become king of the Western Conference with another MVP player next to him, would no doubt be damaging in the eyes of many. And as he'd once promised during their time of turmoil, he'd be ready.